Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. Something that's always difficult thinking about school shootings is realizing what the impacts of these incidents are. There's obviously the loss of life, injury, the emotional trauma, the impact to the school community. But what's really lacking in a lot of the research is what are the broader impacts? What does this do to a community? What does it do to a state? What are all of these things that we think of as the intangible impacts? Because it turns out if you have sound research methodology, lots of impacts are not intangible. They're actually very quantifiable. Along that lines, there was a Google alert that I got recently for an article in the Journal of Marketing Research. And it's about how fatal school shootings impact a community's consumption. And to talk about that, I have the authors of the paper with me here today. Can you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, David. To begin with, thanks for having us here. I'm Muzib Sheikh. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. The paper we are talking about is co-authored with John, who is here with us, and we have three other co-authors. Mike Polazlo, he's a associate professor at UC Davis, and then Adi Patabi, who's an associate professor at Georgia Tech, and Srihari Sridhar, who's a professor of marketing at Texas A&M University's Mays Business School. John?
And thank you, David, for having both of us here. My name is John Costello. I am an assistant professor currently at the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame.
So for starters, how do 5 professors involved in economics and marketing from universities all over the country end up coming together to work on a paper like this?
So I'll start with that. So essentially, Dr. Sridhar, Hari Sridhar, he's actually my advisor. I did my PhD at Texas A&M, and then I was moving to IU to start my career as a faculty. It was around that time we sort of came up with this idea and then started the ball rolling with it. So the trigger for that idea is actually from a paper published in PNAS about depression and anxiety drugs, the consumption of those going up after school shootings. So me and Dr. Sridhar started talking, and we thought this was interesting that beyond just the people who are actually in those schools, there's a spillover onto the community surrounding that area. And then we started thinking about how we can capture that in terms of the spillover onto the entire community. And the most conservative thing we can look at is groceries. Do their preferences for certain things change or don't change? That's where we got started with this. And then since I was in the move, we reached out to a couple of friends of ours who actually had experience working with Nielsen data, which Dr. Sridhar and I at that time did not really have any prior engagement with. So Mike and Adi, they were actively working on other projects with Nielsen data, looking at things like nutritional changes after school nutritional mandates and things like that. So they are kind of like the experts in that data set. So we reached out to both of them saying, hey, this is what we were thinking. Will you be interested in sort of trying to address this question? Going in, we did not have a priori expectations as to which direction the efforts would go. One way is you can think of it as there could be avoidance behavior where people will avoid consumption, or there could be a reward-seeking behavior where people are stressed and they start consuming more of certain things and less of certain things. So it was an empirically open question. We started looking at the data, and that's where we got started. We had an initial version of the paper where it was just Nielsen data, and we were also looking at some spillovers onto home values and things like that. And we wanted to expand that further, where when we were presenting these things across places, we were getting the feedback constantly that what is the mechanism, why are these things happening, why are the results you're seeing transpiring the way they are. That's when we reached out to John, who's an expert in psychology, consumer psychology. He's a consumer behavior researcher. We reached out to him saying, hey, this is what we have, and these are the questions we are getting when we are presenting this to different people. So, are you interested, and do you want to come on board and help us expand the scope of the paper? That's where John got added. John, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I think it was sort of a unique project for me. Typically, a lot of times my research projects will be more like coming up with an idea, collaborating with co-authors. This was a really interesting situation where they had this really kind of important real world effect, and they had presented it quite a bit. So they had gotten really good and thoughtful feedback from people in our field about like why it might be happening. So when we were trying to tackle those questions through some of kind of the experiments that I conducted, we could look to kind of existing theory, but also some of the other kind of questions that people had from their own sort of experiences, potentially as consumers in places where these things happen. So really grateful that Muzib and the team asked me to join.
For people who are not in academia and higher ed, some papers come out. Sometimes there's one author, sometimes there's a bunch of authors. What's the incentive and reason to assemble a team of folks across multiple disciplines to be part of one of these papers?
So generally, at least in the field of marketing, there has been a recent push towards multi-method research where you're taking multiple perspectives on addressing a same sort of a fundamental question. One is an economics perspective where consumers are rational agents, and let's look at what are the decisions they're making. That's one way of looking at it, or understand the psychology behind what is happening. Why are they making those choices? So there has been recent push towards that multi-method research, multi-method approach to addressing research problems. That's where this sort of a multidisciplinary team sort of emerged in the context of this paper specifically. Yeah.
And before we get into the findings from this paper, for anybody who's not involved in marketing, can you just explain kind of that basic theory that consumers are making rational decisions, and then those rational decisions would be impacted by things that are happening around them? Like, where did that come from, and where else do you see it?
Okay, so generally there's rich work in behavioral economics, which speaks about how consumers' behaviors or rational agents, when they're exposed to certain emotions, they behave in a certain way, behave in a different way than a rational agent would do. That's where the entire stream of research of behavioral economics sort of builds on that. Consumers are no longer rational; they're sort of biased one way or the other. And then there's rich literature in the psychology, which points to that. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd add to Muzib's points, which I think you did a great job of summarizing. I think, and again, I'm not a trained economist, but I think traditionally economic theory thinks a lot about things like supply and demand, prices, and how that impacts people's consumption behavior. Behavioral economics, as Muzib kind of pointed out, thinks about human emotions, the way things are framed, more kind of psychological. Motivation would be another one. Different psychological variables and how that also might impact the way that we consume. So kind of merging those two worlds together, I think, is a really powerful way of tackling these problems, because people oftentimes do behave as rational agents, but not all the time. So understanding kind of those two sides of the coin, I think, is a really helpful way to address a lot of different kind of questions around human behavior.
Well, obviously, I'm a sucker for behavioral economics, since I just had a recent episode with Dr. Jens Ludwig from University of Chicago, and he's obviously one of the leaders in there, as well as Daniel Kahneman, which we talked about extensively through that. And my PhD dissertation is based on Kahneman's work. So I absolutely wish that I was actually doing the research that you all are doing, because I think it's some of the most interesting research to understand that all of these things that might seem random or might not seem connected are a lot of kind of derivative behaviors that we're doing without even knowing that we're doing them. So in this, you wanted to measure the impact of school shootings through some of this economic data. How did you start finding the variables, and how did you select the variables that you were going to measure?
Initially, when we started with Nielsen home scan panel. For those of you who are not aware of the data set, it's primarily Nielsen has this set of panelists. They keep track of what are the grocery purchases they're making whenever they go and shop. They basically scan one of their receipts to Nielsen. Nielsen collates all of that and makes it available for researchers and probably firms who are willing to buy to understand consumer behavior. So we started with that data set because if these households are living in communities which are affected by these school shootings, their behavior in terms of grocery purchases, which is sort of like a staple, doesn't matter what's happening around the world, you still have to go buy groceries to sustain. So if we find an effect there, that will be the most conservative estimate of what is happening. So that's how we started with Nielsen data. So we started looking at first what is happening to the overall consumption, which is the spending they have per grocery trip, or we collate it at a weekly level and look at what is happening to consumption of households at a weekly level around 6 months after, or within a 6 months time period after these school shootings happen. So that was our primary variable. And there's also literature which speaks about how when people are stressed, they consume more of alcohol, cigarettes, or sugary items and things like that. So we started building other variables related to that, which are like what is the value of sugar they're consuming in the food they're buying, or what is the value of added sugar they're consuming, things like that. So that's where our initial analysis started. What we found is that initially that there's a decline in spending, meaning the consumption is going down. And we did not see much effect of that consumption going up or the sugar consumption going up. Then, when we started to explore this further, we sort of got to this idea that people are anxious about spending time outside. That's probably one of the reasons why this could be happening. And then we started constructing other variables which will sort of proxy for some of these anxiety related behaviors, which is avoidance related. So if they are anxious, they would go on lesser number of trips, lesser number of days they go to shop, or the number of stores they visit might also go down. So we started building these additional variables, looking at what is happening to their shopping behavior, how they are going to the store, how much, how many, because we don't have data on how much time they spent at the grocery store, because that's not available in Nielsen dataset. So we proxied that by number of departments within a grocery store they go around and shop. Right? If they're anxious, they don't want to sort of keep shopping around the grocery store, so the number of departments they buy from might also go down. So that's one additional variable we created. So we sort of built on what we have from the Nielsen data and sort of created these variables which can reflect on what is happening in their minds. Though this actually exactly doesn't capture that, but that was what we were hoping for when we constructed these variables. And then slowly we pivoted to behavioral experiments, where we sort of capture some of the anxiety by asking explicit questions related to those. John, do you want to add something to that?
No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about the experiments if it's helpful, but I think Muzeem did a great job of covering kind of all the different variables sort of in that primary analysis. And I think one thing that was super helpful from my perspective was, we're able to measure anxiety sort of explicitly in these experiments and ask people like, if you were in this situation, you lived in this town, how anxious, tense, nervous would you feel? And we find effects there, but we also are able to kind of triangulate that with some of the other outcomes that the museum talked about. So the number of departments they're shopping in being kind of consolidated, taking fewer number of trips, all these things that you'd kind of expect if anxiety was the driver seem to be consistent in that data as well as kind of in experiments.
And one more thing to add is, in the process, we decided to split the data based on the political leaning where these incidents happen. Because I mean, like, gun control is an issue related to this, and people have different stances related to that. So we thought that would be an interesting variable to split the data and understand the heterogeneity on those dimensions. But again, with Nielsen data, we don't have the household level political leaning. So we approximate that with what is the political leaning of the county in general and proxy that with that. Whereas when it comes to the experiments, we could explicitly ask people about their political leaning and replicate whatever we find at the aggregate level, or the proxying with aggregate level information at a more individual level. Right? That's the beauty of complementing those research methodologies too.
Yeah, I was really excited. It was really nice to see basically that what we see is sort of county level voting data aligned with what we see when we ask people explicitly where do you fall sort of on the political spectrum. So again, kind of just a little more confidence in the various data sources that we have and the findings we have.
Yeah, and I think that's the goal in academic research is you try to find multiple things that wouldn't really correlate with each other. And then once you can prove that those things are happening in relation to each other, then you start to unpack these novel findings. Like if you did this study of, rainy days and grocery store purchases, and you found that, less people are buying groceries on a rainy day, well, that makes a lot of sense because when it's raining, people don't go out and do lots of things. So, well, you might have, found data where you've got a lot of points of correlation. If you're just proving something that's obvious already, you're not really discovering anything that's useful. I think where this becomes interesting is you wouldn't think that a fatal shooting at a school would have an impact on food and beverage store sales 6 months later. That's where this starts getting into the realm of, whoa, let's think through maybe a public policy because of this, because you all probably know these numbers better than I do, but if you have decreased sales somewhere in the 2 to 3% range across all of these stores in a community, that's pretty quickly adding up to millions of dollars. Did you do any computations of kind of what the real cost of this is nationwide?
So there are two parts to that answer. So initially, when we started the analysis, we started purely with the grocery data. And whatever effects of 2.09% we find was in that grocery data. And again, like most of our academic papers, we went through the review process, and the reviewers sort of pushed us to expand beyond grocery. But one challenge there was there's this new data set from SafeGraph offered through Dewey. That was available where we can sort of study what's happening at stores beyond just the grocery stores. But that data did not overlap with the Nielsen analysis we were conducting, right? So, but that also gave us an opportunity that can we extend beyond the initial time of or horizon of analysis. So we went and looked at the Dewey data set and replicated our findings there. The effect sizes are actually stronger. So we look at all food and beverage stores. There, the effect size is around 3%. And when we expand that and look at a separate set of bars and restaurants and anything not the grocery store kind of things, but where we go out and dine in, there we saw that it's more discretionary spending. We saw that the effect was actually 8%, right? So then we did some back of the envelope calculations to understand what is this impact on average community or average county in the US. So some very rude back of the envelope calculations show that the effect is somewhere around 6 million over that time period for a typical average community in the US. Right? So those numbers are again some of the effects we are capturing primarily in grocery, and we did see that there are spillovers onto other places. So if you just scale it up a little further, that might go up drastically higher. And in terms of the total spending or the pocket of the of the pie of the pocket we capture, we are looking at close to around 14% of entire household spending, and we see these 3% effects in that 14%. If you sort of scale it up further, the effects might the dollar value of that effect might slightly go up further.
And that's, it's important to note for this study, you were looking exclusively at fatal shootings on a
Yes.
school campus. So that doesn't
Yes.
cover the non-fatal shootings that are far more common, shootings in public spaces, mass shootings in public spaces. Those are probably all other things which, well, not studied, this provides kind of a template for the way to think about them. So you could very quickly have something that might seem like a pretty isolated incident end up having a very profound and very costly impact on a community. And just on top of that, with your high fatality school shootings, they are most common in rural and kind of your distant suburban areas. So those are communities where you don't have a really robust business base. And if you lose 8% of your sales as a restaurant for 6 months, like that could be the end of your restaurant.
Yeah. So I think there are definitely anecdotal evidence related to shootings in Uvalde, Sandy Hook, and places like that, where the communities, the business communities surrounding those places definitely did suffer. And even the local business communities came together to sort of interact with the other people in the community to support those businesses too, which kind of warrants this conversation that these are big effects which no one is talking about. I mean, think of grocery stores. They operate on very thin margins, typically in the range of 3 to 4 percentages, which not many people have an understanding about. Like people think grocery stores are flooding in money. That's not the case. So when incidents like this happen, if the spillover effect is this big, it's really hard for those grocery stores. And think of the small businesses in that area, like so they might not have a big cash pool to burn out, right? So they'll immediately run out of business. So these are truly possible scenarios, which I hope our paper sort of initiates a conversation in that direction.
And these further compound on some other papers that I've seen over the last couple of years. There was one analysis of single family home prices where they looked at the areas that had a fatal school shooting and then a bunch of randomized zip codes. And there was a significant drop. All the other types of properties were roughly the same in value, but single family homes and the zip codes around a fatal school shooting fell because a single family home is someone's going to move in there with a family. They want to move into a school district. And if it's the school district that had a shooting, so when you think about it, the home being the single biggest investment or item on the balance sheet for a family, a fatal shooting at a school has profound impact on the value of that. As a second study that some professors at Stanford did a couple of years ago is they looked at the number of emergency room visits for anxiety related diagnoses. And they found that for a full year after a shooting, the zip codes around the fatal school shooting had an increase in those anxiety related emergency room visits compared to all the controls. And besides housing, healthcare is like the biggest expense. So now you all are adding the third point to that, that your basic necessities of food and groceries are also having a very noticeable, quantifiable impact from just one fatal shooting.
Yes, definitely. So the housing angle you mentioned about, I think at least in US, a lot of housing related decisions when you have kids involved in the family are related to the school districts and things like that, right? Like when things like these are happening, definitely there's an impact on values of those houses and things like that. That's the first order effect. Think of the second order effect, which is now the local community is losing tax revenue on that, because there's drop in home values, there's drop in tax revenues, right? So even the drop in consumption we are capturing, the second order effect is that again, when that business happens, there's this tax which is getting generated that is going down. So these communities which are supposed to invest more in sort of making schools safer, they're also losing money in other unforeseen ways when these shooting incidents happen, right? So the tax money they're generating, the city is generating, probably would have gone to some of these sort of security enhancement sort of practices and things like that, right? Definitely, there is enough rich research in that space which speaks to what are the profound impact these school shootings are having on the communities, and we just complement that huge volume of research.
And I mean, just on the larger level, that speaks to something that Jens Ludwig spoke about in our podcast, and that was by his computations, the impact on gun violence for people that will end up not living in an urban area, even though that urban area is often the most housing opportunities, the best housing opportunities, the best employment opportunities, and the best education opportunities. By his calculation, just gun violence in Chicago had lost approximately 2 million potential residents for that city. And then when you think about what Chicago would be like with 2 million people there who are affluent, educated people who have the means to choose where they're going to live, because a lot of times gun violence and a lot of these effects you're talking about the increased, decrease in grocery consumption or decrease in property values, it's like that. Those impact people who don't have a lot of resources the most. So once we start thinking about these on a national level or in large urban areas, I mean, it quickly becomes billions of dollars that we're losing because of fatal shootings. John, what can you say about kind of some of the psychological drivers in some of these decisions?
Yeah, so as we talked about a little bit earlier, the primary driver that we found evidence for was just people's general sense of anxiety about being out in public. Importantly, we ran experiments where we basically tested whether people's more private in-home consumption behaviors might go down. So if you expect that it's not related to being in public, then we might still see effects for those types of consumption, but we don't see that that's impacted following these events. It is specifically things that involve being out in public with other people, which makes sense with this anxiety-based account. That said, we do find evidence that some of the other things that you might think of maybe what might impact people's consumption. So feelings of sadness, feelings of guilt, mourning, potentially feeling distracted, like your kind of day-to-day life is just sort of not the same as it was. We find some evidence that all these things are indeed happening, but they are not the primary drivers of the consumption drop that we see. Really what it comes down to is people feel nervous about going out and being in public after these incidents because it makes them feel vulnerable.
That makes sense with gun violence because there's so much randomness with it. I think that these findings, what everybody can kind of ground some of these feelings in is COVID. And during COVID isolation, a lot of our spending patterns changed. But interestingly, things like alcohol consumption was increasing. A lot of discretionary spending was increasing because it wasn't going places. But in this case, everything is decreasing based on an acute event. And you found that it's actually significantly different in your liberal counties versus your conservative counties. Can you explain that finding in more detail?
So we find differences in our Nielsen data, looking at kind of the county level. We also find in the experiments that the effects are more strong for liberal participants versus more conservative participants. And we find that the amount of anxiety that they feel about being in those public spaces does vary depending on their political ideology, such that liberal participants feel a greater level of anxiety as compared to more conservative participants. And our argument here is kind of building on a lot of other work that shows that people's political ideology influences the attributions that they make about the cause of these events. So essentially, more liberal folks tend to think about these events as tend to think of environmental factors, so things like access to firearms, laws around that access, as playing a larger role, while conservatives tend to place more of that attribution on the individual gunman, right? The idea that there's this lone sort of deranged individual that caused the event, and it kind of follows that if that person's been apprehended, that the level of risk is dropped a lot, if that's what your attribution about the cause of the event is. So that's sort of our argument there, and we do find that there's kind of those ripple effects in terms of the anxiety that people feel depending on their ideology.
So somebody feels that this was an isolated incident, there was a bad person, that bad person is in jail or dead at this point, that there's, you don't need to be scared of going out. But if you're thinking that there are broader environmental factors that are driving this, availability of guns, untreated mental health, depression, just permissible gun laws that allow people to carry in every store and restaurant and public place that you go to, then you're feeling this constant anxiety. That's interesting because just since this is the behavioral economists here, that was exactly the premise in Jens Ludwig's new book, The Unforgiving Places, is that both political sides actually have it completely wrong, that the conservative trope for 50 years has been bad people, and the liberal trope has been that it's bad economic conditions, but actually it's just really bad decisions made in very short windows of time that lead to almost all of this gun violence. And I think that that's very true from everything I've studied at schools over the last 60 years. But if we don't understand that, then people end up making very calculated decisions for an extended period of time. Is there anything in kind of marketing and economics research that explains why people make acutely bad decisions without a lot of rationale, but then all of these much more consequential long-term decisions are actually based in lots of thought, even if that's completely misguided?
Well, it's a really good question about like why do people make these suboptimal decisions? And I would even argue that like even for longer term decisions, like there's a lot of research showing like people often make suboptimal decisions around like their retirement, things that you should have a long time to think about, and that you should be like, these aren't kind of moment to moment things. You have a lot of time. Humans are still humans. We have certain kind of cognitive biases, you know, and we are kind of a product of our environment. So I think that in a lot of the ways that the reason why, you know, liberals form those attributions and conservatives form those attributions relates to sort of like their general worldview, the perhaps like the messages they're getting from the media sources that they engage with. So it kind of makes sense that that's sort of how they would process these events. I will say, and this isn't directly answering the question, but I just want to add, we do see this drop in consumption for both liberals and conservatives. So it's not like conservatives are immune to the potential threat here, and it's not like this doesn't affect the way that they think about going about their everyday lives. It just is it's about basically size of the magnitude of the effect, we say.
From this, it sounds like there are lots of additional places that you could go with your research. There are lots of other data points that could be brought into this. Is this just the starting point? And do you have plans or interests or other things that you think somebody doing research should be looking at in this area?
So again, like you said, this is just a start. At least with our team working on this research, we want to expand this beyond just the consumption on household level spending and look at other dimensions. Some of the like you said, there's also research in the healthcare space which looks at it. We want to sort of add and see if we can contribute there. Another aspect to this is that really the communities or the policymakers of these communities don't really know how to act. So somewhere in our discussion section of the paper, we speak about how when a natural disaster happens, there is FEMA, which has a plan in place to respond to those. Whereas when these things happen, everyone rushes to the place and then consoles the victims and the people affected, rightfully so. But there's no plan to have a resilient outlook towards that and how to return the community back to normalcy. So there we were thinking of some ways we can contribute. Things like how do communities react and do some sort of a trauma related sort of marketing. Because we are marketing researchers, we are calling it marketing, but how can a community come back or bounce back from something like this? So that's another stream of research we are broadly thinking about. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation forward.
Yeah, I think we often in marketing and just behavioral science in general think about interventions, right? So like, okay, it's important to establish that this is happening, but then like, what can we do? How can we make people's lives better potentially after these horrible things happen? And that's a tough thing to figure out, but we talk a little bit in our general discussion around some things that thinking about it from a more policy perspective. And also from a marketing perspective, we often think about communication, right? So how do we convey messages that are going to lead to mitigation of these effects? What are the types of things that we can kind of communicate to the community to get people out and engaged in normal life again?
Yeah, it makes me think about in 2012, the major earthquake in Japan that hit the Fukushima nuclear reactor, and the prime minister initially told the people of Japan, like, we really need to conserve, like, use as little electricity as possible, go out as little as possible. And Japan shut down to the point where it was actually having a negative effect on the economy there, because people were not even getting their basic needs because they believed that the austerity was so important to this. And so the prime minister had to get out and tell people, no, please, go back to the bars, go back to the restaurants. Like, you need to get out there and get the economy going again. And it makes me think about unfortunately, these shootings happen every year. There are multiple fatal shootings at a school almost every month. If a national brand, if the brands that are in communities, you need promotions like a buy one, get one free to encourage somebody to take a friend out after this has happened, a grocery store deal to, you can get a free extra bag of groceries, give it to somebody who's having a hard time after this disaster. If like the business community can all, selfishly realize we don't want to, lose economic activity here, but if there are ways to connect that into really pro-social things of engaging somebody who's isolated in this moment, of connecting with a family who's really hurting in this time of loss.
And building on some of the examples you mentioned, so Walmart actually has right now people who are anxious to sensory sort of triggers. So they have a calm time where these people can go and shop. Similarly, like extending that conversation, we can say that whenever these things happen, if people are really anxious, sort of provide a time frame where you can encourage people to come and shop and sort of have a visible security presence or something like that, which will sort of make them feel more comfortable going out. So again, some of the things we briefly touch upon in our paper, these all things could be done to make people come out and sort of engage in their day-to-day activities. So all those things can be done. At this point, we are just speculating some of it, that this is a possibility. A better way is to actually, borrowing on what John said, marketing is all about communication. How can we communicate to the consumers that it's okay to come out and sort of consume and sort of live their day-to-day life without any fear? Right? If there's work which we can do and sort of give a playbook to both companies and policymakers living in these areas where these things are happening, what to do to get back to normalcy after these things happen. So that's a good place to contribute to as researchers.
And we have a template from COVID, where lots of stores had senior hours.
Yes.
And I don't think there was any medical evidence that senior citizens were more or less safe or exposed during those hours, but it encouraged people to get out, and they felt better. And I really like that idea that, have a visible police presence at the store for this morning. And if you're feeling bad, you can go and you'll be able to do your shopping with the presence of someone there, even though empirically we know that doesn't make any difference in deterrence of violent crime. But that's for a criminology podcast, not the economics one. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that you'd like to add that you think is an important finding that we didn't touch on yet?
The high-level summary of the paper is that we start by looking at fatal school shootings. Specifically, we restricted our sample to between 2012 and 2019 because post that this impact of COVID, we did not want to contaminate the sample, and looked at what happens to consumption of households living in communities impacted by these school shootings in a 6-month time period after those school shootings. And what we essentially find is that there's around 2.1% decline in their spending. And it is supported by other evidence which points to the mechanisms of avoidance, which is the number of store trips they take, the number of unique departments they shop in a grocery store. All of those go down. And then we sort of split this data looking at incidents happening in liberal leaning counties versus incidents happening in conservative leaning counties. We use the presidential election as a proxy to identify these counties. And we find that the effects are stronger, somewhere around 2.4% in liberal leaning counties and slightly weaker in conservative leaning counties. So we then expand this stream of work to look at what happens to other forms of consumption. We again, because of data sample constraints, we had to touch upon some of the COVID periods, but we drop what is happening in terms of consumption during those COVID months and look at data related to what is happening to consumption at grocery stores and alcohol or liquor stores generally, not just household level grocery purchases. There we find a drop in consumption of around 3%. And this is somewhere between 2020 and 2022. And we also extend the same analysis to other stores which are selling these food and beverages, but where you can go dine out. These are, you can think of them as bars and restaurants. So there we find that the effect drops by around 8%. Then we switch to some behavioral studies to explore why this is happening. John, do you want to add a summary of that?
Yeah, sure. So we have 3 studies, and these are all studies with very large online samples. Most of them are nationally representative samples, so we're making sure that we're drawing off of kind of people all across the country on different demographics. And in general, the experiments, there's some differences across them, but the general idea is like it's people come in, it's a scenario where they're learning about a town and they read a bunch of news stories about a town. So we're only manipulating one of the news stories across the conditions. So there's a bunch of, things about a new kind of leaf pickup program in the town and new restaurants opening here and there. But one of the stories is either about a fatal school shooting or another event that involves fatalities, the same number of fatalities, the same identity in terms of the people, so ages and all that, but due to other causes. So typically this was due to a car accident. But we've got other ones where we say, a drowning, other things that are kind of common causes of death among young people. And then essentially we ask people's likelihood to consume in that town. So we look at that in terms of grocery consumption in certain studies. We look at dining out. We look at going to movie theaters in one of the studies. And then we ask them a variety of questions about the emotions they were feeling. If they were thinking about anxiety, as I mentioned before, but also consider things like feelings of mourning, feelings of sadness, embarrassment, guilt, distraction, what's called mortality salient. So basically thinking about the fact that you're going to die. So all these things are ones that we considered. We find some evidence for some of these mechanisms, but none of them are really as strong as for the anxiety mechanism we find. We also measure people's political ideology in these experiments. We find, indeed, looking at this individual level rather than county level, we see these differences between liberals and conservatives in terms of both their anxiety as well as their self-reported likelihood to go engage in these consumption activities. One of the studies, we also examined whether the consumption activities were in public versus in private. And we find that the effect emerges for public activities, so things like going to the grocery store, going to a movie theater, but not for private activities. So it doesn't impact people's likelihood to order groceries online, for instance. We thought there's a possibility it might actually increase that, but we don't find evidence of that. We find that basically it's directionally there, but it's essentially a null effect. Or watching movies in their own home. That is an impact. So that's basically what those experiments do for us.
My final question for both of you is the people that can really take action with these findings are your policymaker, your politician or leader at the federal, state, and local level. What would you want somebody to do with the findings in this paper?
So, like you said, we also think that businesses also have a role to play. We'll touch upon that at the end. But policymakers, whenever they're making a case for sort of how to avoid or prevent these incidents from happening, there is enough reason to believe that these are bad things for the community. Some of the research we discussed from other streams during the podcast sort of highlight that. We are saying that there's an additional reason to prevent these, and the anxiety mechanism we show, which sort of leads to this drop of consumption. If there are ways in which you can avoid or prevent that anxiety in the community through some sort of interventions, some of the interventions we discussed, if they can make that effort to make people not feel anxious, that will be a good thing. The other thing is what can businesses do, right? So right now, when we think of these issues, we never think of businesses having a role in this. We are saying that, hey, they also have a skin in the game in this, right? When these things happen, they're losing business. If they're thinking of supporting some initiatives which sort of avoids such incidents, this gives them incentive to think that, hey, we are spending a lot of money on other streams when it comes to our CSR spending. Might be divert some of this here, because when an incident happens, we are taking a hit after that. Might as well proactively contribute to causes which support these things, right? So those are the two dimensions I can think of. John?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I think Muzib did a good job talking about, like from a business standpoint, providing support to those businesses, things businesses can think about. I would also just add, like, I always think as academics, we're just also interested in providing like useful causal information, and hopefully, one goal, at least a personal goal, would be that like this would come into larger policy conversations about the impact of expense. So I think like obviously the loss of human life is the primary thing that most people are going to think about, and that's super important. But these other factors are also really important, and I think worth considering when we're thinking about, the frequency of these incidents and what can be done about it. So I think just like having this additional kind of kernel, another piece kind of this larger picture, hopefully, it could be part of that conversation and the broader conversation around, as you mentioned, impacts on healthcare and housing prices and all these other things. Hopefully, all that together can help inform some of the policy discussions.
Well, as you can tell, I absolutely love behavioral economics. So anytime there's a paper like this, I want to talk about it, and I want to thank both of you for taking the time to go over your findings today. The paper is How Fatal School Shootings Impact Communities' Consumption. There's a link to it in the show notes. John, Zeeb, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. And again, thanks a lot for putting together the data set so that other researchers can work on it. That has been a valuable resource to us.
Absolutely. Yeah, if there's not information there, there's not a lot that we can do with it. And if you don't have evidence, you make assumptions, and assumptions usually do not turn out well. Well, thank you all so much, and thanks for listening today.
Thank you.